I'm the chair of this panel. My name is Justin Phillips. I'm also the chair of the political science department, which I think is why I was asked to chair, not for my deep knowledge of international relations and civil conflict. But there's many bad things about being chair. And one of the good things is being able to participate in these events that celebrate the work and accomplishments of one's colleagues. So I am given 3 minutes to do the introduction, so I'm not going to go into lots of detail about the very accomplished panelists here. But I'll start with Sarah Daly, who's the professor whose work we're here to celebrate, honor and probe also. And Professor Daly is assistant professor in political science here and also a faculty fellow at the Salzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. Violent Victors is not her first book, but her first book was Organized Violence After Civil War, the geography of recruitment in Latin America, and was published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. And of course, her second book is the one that we're here to talk about, Violent Victors, Why Bloodstained Parties Win Post-War Elections. And Sarah does much more than write books, and her research has appeared in numerous top journals within political science, including World Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, International Security, Comparative Politics, and many others. Our first commenter today is Michael Gilligan, who's a professor of politics at New York University's Wilf Family Department of Politics. And his research explores the effect of various types of international interventions on the societies in which those interventions take place. And the sorts of interventions he looks at include things like peacekeeping, post-conflict reconstruction aid, ex-combatant reintegration programs, and the teaching of tolerance and nonviolence. And he has many publications in journals, and I have two recent ones I just grabbed for examples of his work. The Promise and Pitfalls of Peacekeeping Economies, which is forthcoming in International Studies Quarterly, and International Gender Balancing Reforms in Post-Conflict Countries, Lab in the Field Evidence from Liberian National Police, also in International Studies Quarterly. Then we have Andreas Zimmer, who is on the panel with the with the fire alarm. Fingers crossed. Or you were in attendance? Were you not on the? Were you on the panel, or were you just in attendance?
And we learned we should not.
Do not use the elevator. So you learned something. Hopefully, we all knew that already. Don't use the elevator.
We didn't know it.
If anyone wants to know what happened to the political science department, we all took the elevator during a fire. Andreas is the Lieber Professor of Sociology and Political Philosophy at Columbia University, and his research brings together long-term historical and global comparative perspectives to the questions of how states are built and nations are formed, how racial and ethnic hierarchies form or dissolve in the process, and when this will result in conflict or war. He has published many books, two of which are Nation Building, Why Some Countries Come Together While Others Fall Apart, and Waves of War, Nationalism, State Formation, and Ethnic Expulsion in the Modern World. And then last but certainly not least is Lisa Anderson, who's the special lecturer and James T. Shotwell Professor Emerita of International Relations at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Professor Anderson's scholarly research includes work on state formation in the Middle East and North Africa, on regime change and democratization in developing countries. And among her books are The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya, and Pursuing Truth, Exercising Power, Social Science, and Public Policy in the 21st Century. All right, and with that, I will turn the floor over to Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much to the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center and ISERP for hosting the event. Thank you so much to Mike, Andreas, Lisa, Justin for reading the book and engaging with it so thoughtfully that we could have this discussion. And thank you to our audience for being here tonight. So my book is about elections after civil wars, why so many people vote for parties that committed mass atrocities in war. And the seed for the project was planted when I was an undergraduate at Stanford, and I took a politics of human rights course where we learned about the Pinochet coup and the repressive dictatorship that left over 40,000 victims. And I assumed that everyone, all Chileans, would naturally reject Pinochet given these human rights abuses. And then I went to live in Chile, and I lived with a family that was very much pro-Pinochet, joining the ranks of 44% of the population that was pro-Pinochet even after the transition to democracy. So I was struck by this. I was struck again when I was researching my first book, which, as Justin alluded to, looked at why half of peace agreements succeed while half fail. And for this book, I spent 18 months in Colombia interviewing hundreds of former combatants, paramilitaries, and rebels and their victims. And the former fighters and their victims told me about the indiscriminate massacres and torture and rape that the forces had carried out. And yet I found that in many places, the populations supported the armed groups and their allied politicians, even after handing over their weapons and demobilizing. And I found that these patterns exhibit themselves very broadly around the world. After winning peace, populations vote for parties with deep roots in the armed organizations of the past. For example, in Guatemala, in 1999, the party of General Rios Montt, accused of genocide, won the election. In El Salvador in 1994, the party most closely tied to the death squads responsible with the armed forces for the vast majority of political killings, won the elections. In 2018, the party of President Alvaro Uribe, who was facing hundreds of investigations for ties to paramilitaries, and what Human Rights Watch called one of the worst episodes of mass atrocity in the Western Hemisphere, won the election. When I began researching the book, I thought that how much violence the parties committed would likely determine their electoral success, and that they were probably winning the votes not of their victims, but of non-victims. But I found around the world in all cases of civil war after since 1970, that indiscriminately violent rebels did just as well in the elections as those that exercised restraint in their use of violence. That terrorized regions voted for these parties in equal proportions to those regions left unscathed by the wartime campaigns of violence, and that victims themselves were equally likely to support their perpetrators as they were parties unstained by war. And so then I thought maybe it is a story of coercion, that people are voting with guns to their heads. But I found that these parties were also winning democratic, free and fair elections. They were winning the votes of those that were voting freely without fear. They were winning people who were really scared about war recurrence, but also those who did not fear war recurrence. They were winning undecided, were not automatically winning undecided segments of the electorate, but rather had to work hard for those votes. So I thought maybe it's a story of a fog of war, that voters were ignorant about the atrocities or didn't know whom the perpetrators were. But many of the elections took place after truth commissions had reported. And so voters tended to know the facts of the violence. So why do people vote for parties that committed mass atrocities and war? In short, peace and security. I find that it doesn't matter how much violence the parties carried out in war. What matters is the military outcomes of the war. If war winning, bloodstained parties can credibly, successfully campaign as the best providers of future societal peace, counterintuitively convincing the populations that they will protect them. Violent victors win or earn credit for peace. This credit for peace serves to justify their use of atrocities. They convince the population to compare their violence in war not to a world in which no violence took place, but instead to a world in which the violence continued. And relative to this really bleak outcome, voters give to these parties their support because of the relief that peace brings. But voters have very good reason to question whether the parties will turn their guns against them again in the future. And so to do well in post-war elections, these parties have to convince the population that they possess not only James Madison's first requisite of government, the strength to control the governed, which they clearly have given their military victory, but also the restraint to control themselves. And there are a variety of tactics the parties can employ to signal both strength and restraint. So for example, they moderate positionally. They also do so in their candidate choice. In Guatemala, FRG party, which carried out the Mayan Holocaust, ran as the face of the party, Rios Montt, and he was sort of clad in fatigues and was played the role of the old-fashioned caudillo who arrived on horseback to save the nation. But then it paired this strong man with leftist Portillo, a victim of the conflict that signaled that the FRG would not re-victimize the armed and unarmed left in the future. So desperate for peace, voters elect bloodstained parties for protection. So you do know something about this. So if in American politics, elections are about, it's the economy, stupid, and in context emerging from the anarchy of civil war, it's about security. And these elections have really important implications for peace and justice and democracy and welfare. So the book finds, against frequently cited concerns, that post-war elections are not necessarily destabilizing, leading to war recurrence. But instead, the strong military position of the war winners deters remilitarization by their rivals. So peace tends to consolidate. But in electing peace and security, voters tend to forego or postpone electoral accountability and suffer degradation in their democracies and in their welfare. The electing perpetrators of heinous crimes against humanity is not good for justice. These parties tend to lock in their amnesties. But over time, as the power of the parties wanes, justice may become more possible. The election of these bloodstained parties tends to preserve democratic rules, electoral rules, because the parties preserve the system that brought them to political power. But it tends to block or hinder democratic deepening and lead to democratic backsliding. And finally, voters tend to gain in the area in which these parties have a perverse comparative advantage in competence, and that's the security domain, but they tend to lose in the welfare area because these parties prioritize law and order over social and development expenditures. So I look forward to your comments and to a fun discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll turn the floor over to Michael.
Okay, thank you. This on, I think, and turn yours off. Okay. I think this book is really a social science tour de force. this book has everything. It has close and detailed case studies of not only Colombia, which she knows extremely well, but El Salvador, Guatemala, other countries. There's large and quantitative cross-country analysis of the covariates of what lead these former belligerent parties to do well. There's survey experiments that she designed herself to more directly test her argument, her violent victors argument. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think that was really well done. And she even has a little bit of a formal model in there, which I don't want to scare potential readers away. It's only a couple of pages, but I wanted to mention it because I really appreciate it. It made understanding her argument, it lent a lot of clarity to her argument and made understanding exactly sort of what the sequence of moves were and what people's utility functions were and things like that. It helped me understand much more quickly and clearly exactly what was going on in her head when she was crafting this argument. So I certainly appreciate that. I realize I'm probably a minority within the American Political Science Association in thinking that way, but I want you to get credit for it. It was quite well done. So the book makes an important theoretical contribution to the study of post-war politics and post-war democratization. And Sarah alluded to this a little bit, but in particular, the argument about why these violent groups succeed in post-war electoral politics is, I think, a lot subtler and more nuanced than kind of the conventional wisdom that was out there before she did this work. So previous explanations for this phenomenon of sort of atrocity committers getting elected, sometimes it goes by a variety of names. One of them is warlord democracy. These have argued that parties that are formed from these very violent war time groups succeed through a kind of tacit electoral blackmail, sometimes explicit electoral blackmail, but at least tacit electoral blackmail. So in this argument, voters vote for these parties because they're afraid that the parties will return to the acts of violence if they lose the election. So the implication then is that these early post-war elections are tainted because voters are choosing the previously violent party with a proverbial and sometimes an actual gun to their head. And I think what Sarah has indicated is that that's not necessarily the case, that these parties have, as she indicated, have to compete for these votes. So it has an element of democracy, albeit perhaps somewhat tainted with the threat of violence ever present, but that these groups really are competing for votes in a sense. So, as I said, one of the things that I like most about Sarah's argument is again that it's subtler and more nuanced than these previous arguments that have tried to explain the success of these violent parties. And Sarah went through some of the alternative hypotheses in her remarks. So I think the subtlety is in her argument, violent groups that are successful enough to at least fight to a draw or a stalemate in the Civil War win these elections, not by simply threatening voters, but because they make a better argument to voters in three ways. First, or they offer a better choice to these voters in three ways. First, as you mentioned, in post-war societies, security is the main issue that people care about, and these groups can plausibly make the claim that they're good at security. If they didn't win the war, they at least didn't get beat. So they kind of know there's a competence argument. They kind of know what they're doing on that score. Secondly, and relatedly, I think these parties get credit for peace because even though they were doing fairly well militarily, they didn't take it to the next stage and try to defeat people outright. They came to the negotiating table. They negotiated a peace agreement that included elections. So they're getting credit for the peace process for that reason, because they laid down arms, or at least reached a negotiated settlement, ostensibly in a time when they could have won, or at least certainly prosecuted the war. And then finally, as kind of a cherry on top, what these parties do to sort of earn this vote, in a sense, is what she mentioned with this fellow in Guatemala, right? Which is they're going to put the strong man or strong woman, it does seem to always be a man in these cases, but they're going to put him at the top of the ticket because he is showing people that these guys are good at security. But of course, voters are also worried that he might be too good at security and start violating their rights. And so for that reason, they mix in these other people. So I think that's another thing which really, if it was just a matter of threatening folks to voting for you, you wouldn't do that, right? That's going to dilute that, or that brand or that threat. So yeah, it suggests that the strongman is going to be at the top of the ticket so that they get credit for the security issues, but it's going to mix in these civilians and people that are untainted by the war to signal this commitment to peace. And again, signaling a commitment to peace is exactly the opposite of what you would do if you were in fact trying to threaten folks into voting for you. The related benefit of Sarah's argument compared to those earlier ones is that I think it kind of goes beyond explaining why, as the subtitle says, bloodstained parties win elections. So the book is called Violent Victors, so it's about why these violent types win. But there's other sorts of parties in there that I think she spells out in a way that are often given or maybe not looked at as carefully in this post-conflict literature. So her argument suggests that while these parties that either weren't belligerents or weren't very good belligerents, and so they're sort of on the verge of being defeated, they're not going to be able to claim the security advantage, which is obviously a huge advantage in a political context like this. They do have things that they can do. So the rule abider can sort of claim that, we complied with the rules all along. And there's even what she argues is a decent strategy for the belligerent party that lost, and it is what she calls the let's see, the immoderate, tactical immoderate. Yeah, my font's a little small here. So these tactical immoderate, and so in this, and this is the particularly interesting one, right? And it comes back to this sort of argument about is this good for democracy and bad for democracy, or what is this? Because if the loser of the war takes this tactical moderate approach, what is it that they're doing? They're ceding the first 1 or 2 or 3 post-war elections on the security issue, which is what folks are going to be most concerned about. But eventually other issues are going to come in to the fore. So they're kind of pre-building their brand on whatever it is, probably egalitarianism or something of that sort. And so if these folks have faith in that the democratic system is going to be relatively long lasting, they should be able to look out into the future and see that they can that they can pre-position themselves on these issues that may become more important later. And I'll come back in a second of sometimes parties do this, and sometimes, in her main case, Colombia, they didn't, I think to their detriment. So let me just go on to another main contribution. I should say probably the main contribution in terms of number of pages in the book is the empirical contribution. So the vast majority of this book, by page numbers, is empirical content to support her argument. There's a lot there. As I said, there's large N quantitative analysis. There's close-in case studies. There's a nice regression discontinuity thing about which is where she found that these bloodstained parties tend to be overly focused on security and less on sort of other public goods. But the thing that I really want to recommend to your attention are these conjoint experiments that she did, because these are really quite convincing. So a conjoint experiment is this kind of technology that people in marketing develop to sort of give people a bunch of different like flavors of ice cream to find out which one was going to sell the best. Political scientists can use it to sort of get like which mix of candidates are going to do best in an election. So that's kind of what's going on here. And so you randomly give, and in her argument, they fall along several dimensions. They can focus on their belligerents, they can focus on their civilian character, they can be ideologically immoderate, they can be moderate, and so on. So what you do is you sort of populate this chart randomly with different combinations of these, and you can infer from that who is most likely to do, and then ask the respondents which one do you like the most, and you can infer from that which candidate's going to do. So what she did is she did this with in Colombia, and what she found I think is quite striking. She found that, and this was done in 2020, so it was 2 years after, it was in between the two elections. It was during COVID, so that's not fun. I've been there. And so, there's some hiccups along the way, but I think the best evidence she found was really that had the FARC party, which now goes by the name of the Communist Party, had they actually done what your strategy suggested, they probably would have done a lot better, right? Because if you look at the way people responded to that particular, in other words, if they really had been these tactical immoderates and not focused on their war record, they according to her results, they would have actually done better. Respondents responded more favorably to that. The results were kind of a little less striking with the belligerent government party, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the incumbent belligerent government party didn't adopt that strategy, right? So this is the Santismo party. The party that did was this Uribista party, and they weren't actually in power. So it's a little bit complicated. So it's not clear what the respondents were saying, but I do think that the evidence was really good for this argument, and in particular vis-a-vis the rebels. I'm running out of time if I haven't run out already. I want to turn to something that was not much of a focus of her argument at all, but that I found particularly interesting. I suspect, Paige, you probably also found interesting, which was in her large and cross-country results. And that has to do with the role of UN interventions in these post-war settings. So there's lots of evidence by Paige and lots of other people that peacekeeping missions prolong post-war periods of peace, that they reduce civilian casualties. There's even some recent work that is coming out in the APSR from Rob Blair and Jessica DeSalvatore and a few others that it actually leads to a measure of democratization if the UN mandate specifies that. So if we believe those results, and I do, what would then be the effect of these UN interventions in Sarah's model? So we don't know. She didn't really study it, and this is like, let's file this under ideas for future research. But what I hypothesize it might mean is that this, what she calls the restrained Leviathan, this person who says, look, I'm really good at security, but I'm tying my hands so that I don't abuse it. That's they're not going to have the kind of selling point that they used to have, because the international community is there, kind of guaranteeing, if not guaranteeing, at least shoring up the peace to a certain extent. Now, this wouldn't have shown up in her data because there was no UN mission in Colombia. There was one in El Salvador, and El Salvador actually matches your case extraordinarily well. So, but again, that was also very early days when the UN started sending these things in. So I think that that this might be an interesting area, if not for you, for a bright graduate student or somebody to sort of look into, like, what is the effect of this. Now, Sarah controlled for whether there was a UN intervention in her big cross-country analysis, and what she found, I thought was very interesting, was that it reduced the vote share for the government belligerent party. Now, it wasn't significant, it was highly variant, but the coefficient was quite large. And it just was highly variable. So it makes me wonder, how can we account for that large standard error around the estimate? Well, there's small n, there's undoubtedly some sort of, everything's endogenous, so there's got to be some sort of endogeneity going on there. And then, so those are all things that might have mitigated, but it's sort of interesting, if this is the right strategy, is it going to continue to be the right strategy in these situations now that, or in cases where the UN intervenes? I think I may have babbled on too long. It was sort of making me wonder whether I'm going to sign this release or not. I hope I didn't say anything too silly. Anyway, let me close once again by congratulating Sarah on the publication of this really terrific book. It's an enormous accomplishment, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to come here and share my thoughts and this celebration.
Thank you, Michael.
I would like to join Michael in congratulating Sarah. It's an amazing book. It's a real achievement, and it kind of stands out just in terms of how carefully the research is done and how meticulous and precise and sophisticated the analysis. So just in terms of crafts, from a crafts point of view, it's really an amazing book. Multiple data, Michael has already mentioned that, multiple data sources, experiments, cross-national regressions, a lot of the data sets she did herself, and there's this online appendix. I just glanced at it very briefly, but then thought I'd go for a walk rather than going through every single case. So it's very, it's just best practice in a lot of ways. She's also mastering all these different analytical techniques, from regression to doing experiments to actually understanding cases and contextualizing things. That's kind of a rare skill set. Usually people are not good at mastering all these different kind of analytical techniques at the same level. I also appreciate how much attention she gives to possible data problems, to alternative explanations, complications that are hard to track down empirically, and so on. So that just makes it a very rich reading. And most importantly, the argument, I think, is really good. The argument is also reasonably simple. And it's that people at the end of civil wars, they care about peace more than anything else. And they elect people who promise them peace in the future. So I think that's a really important contribution also to the literature on voting, by bringing in an important element of context. War-torn countries are different from more peaceful countries. And I think we need, in the field of political behavior, more such arguments: macro comparative, macro contextual, macro political arguments. The book is so convincing overall that it risks kind of making the puzzle disappear. So at the end of the book, when I talked to my wife and said, well, why have you been reading this book all the time? I said, well, it's really good. And I said, it says that you end up thinking, yes, of course, people vote for peace after having gone through a massive civil war. She only looks at civil wars that have at least 1,000 battle deaths, so serious wars. Of course, they don't care about human rights violations, since they are rare in most cases. Usually, they concern others, not oneself or one's family, even in places where there was widespread atrocities. Of course, they vote for the party that won the war, and therefore seems to be best able to prevent its recurring, because they can keep the losers of the war in check. So I think the coming away with this kind of impression is actually a sign of the success of the book, not one of its weaknesses. So it really makes the case in a very, very convincing way. But let me probe a little bit and talk about something. I have a bunch of other things that I was I wanted to question, but let me just focus on the one that is maybe the most important one in the interest of time also. So Sarah runs through a whole series of alternative explanations that she rules out. And one you've already mentioned, and you've already talked about it, Sarah, yourself, which is that people vote with the guns on their head, so that they're basically voting because they're threatened by the victors of the war to resume conflict if they're not. So you rule out this, I think, in a very, very convincing way with data from Colombia, with cross-national data and so on. And there's some other alternative explanations that I think you deal with very effectively. But this one that that you haven't really addressed full on, and in the way that you did it, I remain somewhat left unconvinced. And that's kind of an organizational capacity argument. And so it's a simple alternative explanation, which says that the belligerent party, who is larger, has a bigger organization, fighting machine, and that is better organized, and that is popular, more popular. So these kind of organizations win the war, and all of these features of these organizations also are good for winning elections. You can mobilize the vote, you can get the vote out, you can convince people. You have a machine, a campaign machine that can build on the military machine or the associated civil infrastructure that you built up during the war, and so on and so on. So organizational capacity and popularity would then explain both who wins the war and who wins the elections. And so let me now be really mean, Sarah. Can I? And so I read your appendix tables and, in search for support for my argument. I did find some support for that. And so you have this table where the outcome is not the elections, but the outcome is who wins the war. I think it's appendix table 8.3. And so there you have a bunch of things that could influence who wins the war. And there's only one of these factors that turns out to be significantly associated with who wins the war, which is popularity during wartime. And so that kind of hints at the possibility that this is an important factor in explaining Civil War outcomes. You then include this popularity in the main table, in the main text, where the outcome is who wins the election, and it continues to be significantly associated with the outcome, who wins the election, even though you control also for the who won the war. So it might have a kind of contribute through the winning of elections, both directly and indirectly through determining who wins the war. So that's only one part of this organizational capacity / popularity argument. The other parts would be organizational factors, such as the size of these fighting organizations and their how good they're organized. So you have 3 variables in this appendix table, but they're not really measuring that. you have in how far the guerrillas or the rebels are have a chain of command. You have in how far they're financed by natural resources, and in how far they control territory, all of which are maybe related to their organizational capacity, but maybe not. And there's a literature in the Civil War, in the literature on who wins, that uses a bunch of other variables that I wonder why you haven't integrated these. It would be interesting to just see the results. And these are very primitive variables, the number of fighters, right? And not surprisingly, those Civil War parties with larger number of fighters usually win. If you have a tiny guerrilla group, you will not overthrow the government. That's just ever. And another one is how well the government is providing its population with public goods, which is also a measure that is available for almost all countries, and which is a sign of the organizational strength, the organizational capacity. So I'm just wondering what would have happened had you integrated this. I mean, the literature on war termination, who wins, actually, it's very unequivocal. It says these kind of factors play an important role. So I wonder whether if you would done a fuller analysis of who wins, whether these variables that I just mentioned, whether they would also then basically whether the effect would be both on who wins the war and who wins the post-war elections. So that's the one thing that I kind of left wondering of how your thinking goes and how you would if you had more time and maybe another chapter, how you would deal with this possible complication. I think I should stop here, right?
Perfect. Thank you. And now, Lisa.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to read this book and to think about it. And I agree with what everyone else has said. It's a nice, self-contained set of arguments, plausibly constructed and argued and quite convincing. So there you are. I could stop at that point. But I want to sort of pose a few of the kinds of questions that are not about the book itself, in the sense that I think you set out to do what you wanted. You accomplished what you set out to do. But to sort of put it in a different, perhaps, historical and geographical context. And then I have a question about an observation you make in passing about the limits of the research. So first, this reminded me of Chuck Tilley. I had a long wall in common with him in his apartment and my apartment. So lots of things remind me of Chuck Tilley. But this is, of course, the protection racket, very simple idea that, as he puts it, state making and war making as organized crime, that this is basically a protection racket. And a protection racket doesn't, in his characterization, have to be people feeling really threatened. They just want to be protected, and they know how dangerous it is to be unprotected. So I sort of thought, in a way, you could have presented it in a sort of long historical sociology context as well, that pretty much supports what you're saying. You didn't need to do that, but it certainly resonated as I read the book. And there are interesting things about what Tilley himself says, that the would-be power holders, and I quote him, concede protection and constraints on their own action. In other words, some of the things that you accent, I think, are correct, but that's part of why it's an interesting argument. What you do that, of course, Tilley doesn't do is extend it to democratic elections. And that's part of what I think is, from my point of view, an interesting puzzle, because much of the experience of concluded civil wars isn't democratic elections. So from my vantage point, I'm thinking to myself, why have elections? Why not just rule? You won. So that's again, to go back to Tilly, one of the things he says that's interesting about the European experience that he doesn't expect to be true in the contemporary world is the relative subordination of military power to civilian control. Now, you don't ask that question, you assume it, but it seems to me that, at some point you might want to extend that piece and say, under what circumstances do the winners decide to go through electoral politics at all? Because certainly in the parts of the world that I work on, that doesn't typically happen. So there's something about the history, that would be interesting to explore. So that's on the substance. Again, I think given your, scope of work, you don't have to ask that question, but it does seem to me to be an extension that would be an interesting direction to take this if you wanted to. My second set of questions, and again, I don't need to spend this much time on it because I'd like to hear what your reflections are, is you say at the end of your discussion of Columbia, I think, you describe the chapter as having to sought to approximate the theories, parties' strategies so as to experimentally manipulate them. However, given real practical and ethical considerations, there are limits to the ability to do so. This was a society reeling from the effects of 52 years of war, engaged in an already delicate and at times fraught process of writing Colombia's violent history and determining the optimal way to secure its future. The sanctity of this process was to be respected. And I thought that was really interesting. So there's something, I would love for you to talk about what it meant to you to do research in communities under that kind of duress. You talk and you have a nice little article about the security issues, but this is for you and for researchers, and you talk about talking to people with blood-stained hands. But what about the victims? What about the people who were traumatized? How did you think about your responsibilities to them, design the research around the fact that you have, as you yourself say, people who are victimized in many different ways? And I just like you to sort of reflect on that, because as people begin to think about doing this sort of research, having your experience would be, I think, enormously valuable to them.
Thank you very much. I thank all the panelists for great and thoughtful comments, and I am now supposed to turn the floor back over to Sarah to give her an opportunity to respond to some of these comments, and then we'll open up for questions from the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for engaging with my book, really in such a productive way, and for taking such care that you were even in appendix table 7.4, whatever it was. I guess I wish I had used a conjoint for ice cream flavors instead of for what I used it for. So there's to my next project. I think this is a really interesting area for research on the effect of UN interventions, and I like how you've thought about what this hypothesis would look like. And I do, in the policy implications, talk about the fact that violent parties do best when security is salient, and to the extent that you want nonviolent parties to do better, making other issues more salient helps nonviolent parties, and that people value civil liberties and rule of law when they feel safe. And so making people feel safe is obviously a way to promote nonviolent politics. And so one of the implications, not that we need any more sort of effort by the UN to do so, is make people feel safe. And I also talk about how these elections are destabilizing if the balance of power shifts, and how important it is for the UN to focus on averting a shift in the balance of power, military power, after after war, such that the elections are likely to reflect the military balance of power and to have these sort of Leviathan peace outcome that I'm talking about. But I think that that is an area that would be an exciting way to add to the literature on the effects of peacekeeping on democratization, on elections. And I agree with the hypothesis, and think that that would be something I would like to engage with. And I have the opportunity. PSQ has asked me to write a response, and so now I am going to do all of a response and sort of a what are the things I wish I had done in this book, because obviously I can't do anything now, but I can sort of think about, well, what are these other implications that I didn't really address, and include some of these analyses. So, and again, I like this comment about the macro political sort of contextual model of voting, and thinking about how I suggest I use the tools of political behavior in the book, but do suggest that there is an implication for voting models, and how it could be valuable to consider the contextual factors, including the fact that most of these models are built around advanced democracies, and that in much of the world, security issues are very salient and can influence. And our models of voting work very well in these contexts, but they have to take seriously that one of the main issues is security. Thinking about this alternative explanation of organizational capacity, and you did go deep in the appendix. It does matter, I think, only for government belligerents, not for rebel belligerents, if I remember correctly. How I think about the organizational capacity argument, I do think that it really matters for media control and the sort of ability to persuade the population of the messages. I also think that it matters a lot for these parties' success over time, and their ability to build up mobilization machines and compete on non-security issues. And I think that I will go ahead and run these analyses that you're suggesting. And if I find anything, I don't think that the argument is necessarily at odds with what I argue. And I think that I can talk about this in the PSQ article. On popularity, I've always had sort of a bit, I say this in the book, and I'm sure you read this, and so this is not going to convince you, but here is how I think about it, which is that if popularity leads to war outcomes, we wouldn't see the kind of huge changes in war outcomes over the course of a war. But instead, we see that these preferences are quite endogenous. And the outcomes, if you took the outcome of a war at any given time, it would be changing. And then you also, I don't think, would expect to see that the winners of wars would necessarily be demographic minorities, for example, in the case of Rwanda, where the Tutsis win, or ideological minorities, where in Guatemala and El Salvador, the right wins, and the right on behalf of a tiny elite win. I think you would expect different outcomes. And you can't, it can't deal with the undecided, the swing voters, the unaffected, unconflict affected, non-victims that these messages have a lot of persuasive power over. And it does better at dealing with core voters. And finally, I think that potentially a lot of the reason why these actors become popular is because they are able to provide security and bring the war to a close, rather than them being popular and therefore able to be successful in war. And so that is how I push back, but I take the point very seriously, and I will continue to look at it. And finally, again, for this PSQ, I think I would love to engage more with Chuck Tilley's and sort of a longer sociological perspective. These elections are held in almost all cases, but thinking about more about the conditions under which they are, why they're allowed, and the sort of circumstances surrounding the decision to hold elections, I think would be really exciting and promising. On issues of ethics, I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been doing a study on transitional justice where we show videos to victims in Colombia and Argentina, and thinking about, and it reinforces what I did in my book, which was a lot of experiments would make up content. And I think being very careful to only share with victims of a conflict videos and materials and truth commissions that they would come across anyway in their lives, that they would encounter, and being very careful to share the real results of these commissions. I think that other experiments that I did, were hypothetical of different scenarios in which parties ran with different types of candidates and platforms where they were exposed to sort of different combinations, and they were exposed to all the combinations, didn't have the kind of ethical debates. But in this study that I've been really thinking hard about these issues, we find that the transitional justice videos increases victims' anger. And I think in general, being very cognizant of the mental health and the psychological effects of any research in this area that it can have, and coming up with supporting interventions that can be focused on that. And in general, being very careful, as I have always tried to be, and I hope I have been, giving voice to the victims, but at the same time, making sure that the conversations that we have don't cause any additional harm. But I think that it's an area that, in my contributions to fieldwork and research with armed groups and research with vulnerable populations, I've sought to really work on them.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. All right, we're now at the point of the program where we are open to questions and comments from the audience. I think it's just the in-person audience that can ask questions right now. All right.
Hi, Roskell D. I'm a visiting scholar. First of all, congratulations, many congratulations on the book. A couple of questions. First, if I heard you correctly, I think you said that your results hold across voters who fear the recurrence of war and also voters who don't fear the recurrence of war. And I'm wondering, for that constituency who doesn't fear the recurrence of war, why peace and security might be salient for them. And the second thing I wanted to ask about is where the constellation of armed actors overlaps quite significantly with ethnic cleavages, in what way ethnicity might complicate matters. And finally, I was just following the news in El Salvador over the last couple of weeks, and you see the targeting of criminal gangs there and the building of a mega prison. I'm wondering if you think that actually feeds into the sort of like politics that you're getting at, that security permeates all of politics in the aftermath of conflict scenarios. Thank you.
I can use this one. Okay. So I think that in terms of not fearing war recurrence doesn't mean that they still don't value the relief that has come with peace and want to preserve that relief that comes with peace. I was talking about sort of a very empirical finding, which is when asked, do you think that if this party hadn't won the elections, would they return to war? And people who sort of, in that more narrow response, the voting is identical. In terms of ethnicity, this is something that I am pursuing more in my current research. I show that war outcomes determine post-war election results across ethnic and non-ethnic wars, using Andreas's great coding of very detailed coding of this. And I show across a variety of case studies But things look a little different when you get into ethnic conflicts, and it depends on the fluidity of voters and on whether the parties have to seek their victims' votes and whether victims would vote for their perpetrators. And so I sort of take a more constructivist view of this and point to the fact that oftentimes parties, violent parties, target their ethnic brethren in ethnic wars in a way that we sort of don't always think about in ethnic conflicts, such as in Rwanda, where the genocidaires targeted the moderate Hutus, and that people don't necessarily support their ethnic belligerents, but rather they often support non-belligerent parties. And so there are a lot of assumptions we have about how things would work in ethnic conflicts that I think we have to think harder about. But the argument works best where we have this uncommitted middle, where there is fluidity of allegiances, and where voter allegiances are racialized, ethnicized, like not going frozen. You're not going to see some of the dynamics that I point to. I show that it does take, we see the types of party strategies and the types of cross-ethnic voting that my theory would expect in Rwanda, Burundi, Iraq. But then in other contexts, especially those fought over territory, I show that people will not necessarily cross ethnic lines, but they'll move from a belligerent party that's victorious to a non-belligerent. A belligerent party that's losing to a non-belligerent party. So they won't go all the way, but they'll move away from belligerent to a non-belligerent party. Finally, in terms of Bukele, Vicky hosted me on her Institute for Latin American Studies podcast talking about Bukele and the Salvadoran situation and sort of security voting in this context, and the fear-mongering rhetoric and making security very salient. But he's headed for, he has the highest approval ratings ever because of the drop in homicide rates. And we see this kind of very strong voting around the ability to make a credible case on crime, even though it is taking place through incredibly repressive tactics.
Thank you. So my question kind of picks up on that last point. I'm thinking about the Sri Lanka example, which fits the pattern that you talk about, that security is very salient in the immediate post-war period, and then it becomes less salient. But then in Sri Lanka, security becomes salient again. There's a terrorist attack that had nothing to do with the war, and then the most bloodstained, violent victors from the old war, the Rajapaksa brothers, come back to power. And what that leads me to think about is the incentives for these parties as they move into the farther away from the war, where they start to lose their edge because security becomes less salient. They might have incentives to make security more salient. And so that leads to sort of, I don't know, maybe contradictory impulses, right? They want security to be salient, so they want there to be some instability, but they also have to show that they're capable on security, so it can't get too out of hand, right? So what you were just talking about, that like, if the crime rates go down, then they show they're capable again. But if crime rates go down, then security becomes less salient. So this is well beyond, what you look at in the book. But I wonder if you have thoughts on kind of, I know you've been thinking about implications, the sort of long-term implications for democracy, for human rights, for accountability, and how you see that, those kinds of incentives, maybe very cynical, well, not maybe, definitely very cynical incentives to kind of keep the pot boiling just enough for security to be salient, how that works. Thanks.
It's a great question, and one that I'm very fascinated by is sort of what happens to this security brand over time, and when and who can sort of revitalize it and use it. And oftentimes after war, security doesn't necessarily in many cases, security will stabilize and other issues will become more relevant to politics, and it'll become more multivalent, and the parties have to compete on other issues. And if they don't, then their success wanes, and so then they become like they sow the seeds of their demise, and so that brings to the sort of perverse incentive. And there's a lot that you can do, as we see in U.S. politics, with you sort of fomenting how big of an issue crime and law and order is, and making everyone feel with fear-mongering politics. You can do a lot even absent fomenting actual insecurity. But at the same time, you become judged by they become judged by their record on security too. And so we see this in El Salvador, where the parties instituted mano dura and then super mano dura, and then nothing worked. So then they switched and stopped talking about security and started talking about other issues. And around the world, there's so many cases in which parties and strongmen try to revitalize a security brand. And Sri Lanka is a great example. Nigeria, Buhari took a decades-old reputation and said, "I can fight Islamists against Islamists." Fujimori's daughter runs in Peru on his legacy. But then in other cases, like in the Dominican Republic, Trujillo's grandson runs on this and on Trujillo's, iron fist, and it fails. And so I think trying to understand when and why it succeeds is really important. We saw, for example, in Guatemala, years later, someone else who served under Rios Montt ran and failed miserably, and was just like all of the campaign ads were about how he was, present in the Mayan Holocaust. But then he succeeds in the next election. So it also has something to do with the exact conditions and also who they're running against. It seems like it matters, the alternative. And so I'm starting to think more about this, and I hope to have a theory of it at some point. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Congratulations again on your book. I had two things. First, just a point to follow up on Michael's comment about maybe more comparative research on whether UN interventions reduce this valence issue. And the second point second thing I had was a question about related to Andreas's point about organizational capacity. I was wondering if it's an even more alternative explanation of whether you've written about this in other work on high-profile defections from mid-level managers within these rebel groups at the time of negotiating peace. And I wonder if you thought about that in the book when you were researching whether some of these parties that campaign on being able to provide security, are there high-level defections from within the party to start their own party in the post-war era? And does that signal to voters that they aren't able to, keep their own house in order and provide security to voters?
So I did think going into the project that there might be something to this sort of cohesion or fragmentation, and that might be one of the organizational factors that would influence how well they did in war and how well they did afterward. But we see so many cases of confederations or sort of splintered groups being able to still do quite well in elections, from the FMLN in El Salvador that I look at in detail, where they were sort of a disaster coming out of the war in terms of beginning to fragment and lose some of their 5 member factions, to Northern Ireland, to sort of around the world. So I do look at this sort of cohesion fragmentation, and I don't think that is one of the major factors. But returning to this point, and this goes back to something Mike was talking about, incumbency and how we think about incumbency. And there are sort of different ways of thinking about it. There's who was in power at the beginning of the war, the government that was in power, and then which if rebels win a war, they sort of become a de facto government. And so there's sort of confusion in how we think about that. And then there's the electoral incumbent. And so, as Mike mentioned, the book takes non-belligerent parties, non-combatant parties quite seriously. And in Guatemala, the party that was in power at the time of the founding elections was a non-combatant party. And so they were the electoral incumbent. And so I think that that can matter. And electoral incumbent means you control the state media usually, and that seems to play a particularly strong role, particularly after cases of draws or sort of where the two parties have similar convergent electoral strategies to win the support of war-ravaged voters. It matters who controls the means of persuasion.
Maybe this is our last question. I think it's scheduled to end at 6. So anyhow, we've got a little bit over.
Okay, I'll keep this short. Thank you so much and congratulations again. So I guess I'd follow up on that. I wonder if you think the role of public memory is overtaken by the sense of security?
What do you mean by public memory? Sort of the historiography or the
Yes, like the
sort of record?
historiography and just thinking like the children of these violent leaders who are able to run and who are given the platform to run, if you think, or even like taking over the media, if that has any role on the sense of security and like overtaking.
Well, I think that the sort of the narrative of what happened in war is very complicated and interesting, and who people attribute blame to. And I think that the project in general points to the fact that there's kind of this disconnect between objective violence, the facts of the violence, and how people understand the violence, and the war outcomes create a chasm at times between these two and how people attribute blame. And so I show in the book that even when presented with facts of violence, people will still blame the losing side more than they blame the winning side for the violence, even if the winning side carried out 95% of atrocities. And so figuring out how to change that narrative takes, I think, at times decades, especially when they have when these parties win and therefore lock in their power and are able to continue to propagate their story of what happened. And as I was sort of referring to the study that I'm currently doing, the fact that apologies and truth and trying to correct the historical record can actually increase levels of anger of victims if they don't attribute blame to that actor apologizing, points to the fact that it's a little unclear how to correct the historical record if truth-telling and apologies don't do so. And so maybe there's just I don't know if it's time, because I also find that justice becomes more possible over time, but if you wait too long, then it comes too little too late and doesn't really work. And so I think it's a really important sort of set of issues on which I'm continuing to think. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah.